Is America mentioned in the Bible? Did she have a God-given destiny? We're going to cover that topic in this program. We're going to show the religious history that's been left out of the founding of this nation. And we also want to cover the parallels to America with the land of Israel. Let's start with Leif Erikson. Now, Leif Erikson was the son of Eric the Red, and Eric the Red was the founder of the first settlement in Greenland. Now, Leif Erikson, around 1000 BC, sailed to Norway and was converted to Christianity. Now, Erikson was the son of Eric the Red, and on his way home to Greenland, where the Norwegian king had sent him to Christianize the natives, he sailed off course, and we believe that he landed in the area of Nova Scotia. Now, some accounts say that Leif Erikson was actually looking for the land of America. The land was rich and had many grapevines, and so he named the land Vinland. He actually took a whole boat of grapes back with him when he sailed. He spent the winter in Vinland and then sailed back to his home in Greenland. Now, this was somewhere around 1000 AD, 4 centuries before Christopher Columbus would come on the scene. So the very first name for America was Vinland or Vineland. Now in Matthew 21, the Messiah is discussing with the Pharisees the parable of the vineyard. Now I want to pick up on verse 42. And Jesus said unto them, Did you never hear the scriptures? The stone which the builders rejected, the same became the head of the corner. Therefore I say unto you, the kingdom of God shall be taken from you and given to a nation bringing forth fruit thereof. So no doubt that God had a hand in naming America Vinland. So who was the nation bringing much fruit? The early colonists believed they were that nation. And you can see the example of grapevines and vineyards running all through our early history. Now in 1492, we're very familiar with the story of Columbus. He sailed for the nation of Spain. And the interesting thing about this discovery of Christopher Columbus is that he landed on the island of San Salvador on the last day of the Feast of Tabernacles. And the next day would represent the last day, last great day, which is referred to as New Beginnings. How unbelievably significant. And this is what would have been read by the Jews at that time. On the last day of the Feast of Tabernacles, they would read the following. Establish us as your chosen vineyard and make us as a tree planted by the stream of water. Now, there's an analogy in Scripture to Elizabeth, who was the mother of John the Baptist, and Mary, her relative, just like there's an analogy between Queen Elizabeth and Mary, Queen of Scots. Now, Queen Elizabeth actually started the exploration of America. Now, we know that Elizabeth was the mother of John the Baptist, and he would be the voice crying in the wilderness. Now, the very first explorer for England would be John Cabot. So there's a parallel here between John Cabot being the very first explorer and John Baptist. And of course, the royal line, the Messiah, would come from Mary. And Mary, Queen of Scots, would have a son named James, who would sit on the throne of Scotland as James VI, and on the English throne as James I. And this is a time when a Scottish king would rule England and sit on an English throne. Unbelievable. Now, in 1602, Bartholomew Gosnold was sent to America to explore and find an area suitable for a colony. He would explore and find the area called Cape Cod. He named the area Martha's Vineyard after his daughter, Martha. He would again return to America on the very first voyage. He was captain of the Godspeed, which was one of the 3 ships that came to the New World. Now, according to America's Vineyard by Bill Cloud, Gosnold would explore Cape Cod in 1602, which is 110 years after the time of Columbus. And 1602 would be a sabbatical year. Now, you'll continue to see this theme about vineyards running all through America in this early colonization. Now, the second colony, the second English colony, would be established in 1607, and that is the colony of Jamestown. They traveled up the Chesapeake Bay, up the rivers, the James River, and settled in what is known today as Jamestown. But remember that James means Jacob. So this was the very first settlement, successful settlement in the New World for Britain, was named after Jacob. It was Jacob's town. And the river was called James River or Jacob's River. Obviously, God had a hand in the naming of this town. And it was established on May 14th, 1607. Remember, May 14th was the date of the establishing of the founding of modern-day Israel. So that very first colony was named after Jacob. But in 1620, we then had the Pilgrims. Now remember, the Pilgrims had left Britain because of uniformity acts by Queen Elizabeth, which forced everyone to attend church on Sunday. Now, they were separatists, and we need to talk a little bit about separatists. The separatists were a people who wanted to separate from the Church of England, and they were persecuted by Queen Elizabeth and King James. Now, while the Pilgrims were in Holland, they realized that Spain was creating war plans against Holland, and so they felt like they needed to leave and go to America. But many of the people in their church stayed behind with John Robinson. Now, they received a charter to settle in the area of Virginia, but their boat was blown off course, and they would land, as fate would have it, at Plymouth Rock. They would not be under the government of the Virginia colony. So they created what they called the Mayflower Compact. And the Mayflower Compact would serve as a form of government for the Pilgrims. It's the foundational document for the Fundamental Order of Connecticut, which we used in this country as a foundation for our Constitution. Now, the Pilgrims landed in this place that was already cleared. Now, 4 years before they landed, there was an Indian tribe here, which was the most fierce tribe on the eastern coast, and they were completely wiped out by disease. And now the other Indian tribes around that area feared that area because they were afraid that they would catch the same fate. So no doubt God prepared this place for these pilgrims that were landing in America. All these early colonists felt like they were the Israelites leaving Egypt, leaving the tyranny in Britain and Europe behind. And no doubt we can see that analogy. Now, the next group we want to talk about is the Puritans, and they get their name from purifying the Church of England. They did not want to leave the church, they wanted to purify the church. In 1626, King Charles began a persecution against the Puritans, and it caused the migration of the Puritans to America. In 1629, Charles dissolved Parliament and ran the country himself. This would result in his execution. Now, many people in this country today have given the Puritans a bad rap. They are referred to as a pious, self-righteous group of people, strict and austere. But that is not at all what they were like. The word pious used to mean something good, but apparently today it does not. They would settle in the area of Boston, Salem, and Concord. Now, the descendants of these people who believed in keeping God's laws diligently, the descendants of these people would be the people that God would choose to start the American Revolution. It would start in Concord. Now, the religious leader of this colony was Cotton Mather, and he believed that the Bible needed to be the basis of all government in the Massachusetts colony. and it was. It's not hard to see that because the Salem witch trials was based on the teaching from Scripture that says you shall not suffer a witch to live. So you could see that these people were very staunch in following the Old Testament laws. Now, it's very important to mention one other fact, and that is the colony of Massachusetts felt like, and they called themselves God's America's Israel, as God's America Israel. Now, Winthrop arrived in 1630. He first went to Salem. From there, he went and settled at Charlestown. Again, this was the colony set up at the mouth of the Charles River, which is right across from Boston today. And this would be the seat of the American Revolution. Now, Cotton Mather would refer to Winthrop as Winthrop Nehemias, after Nehemiah in the Bible. He compared him to Nehemiah in the scriptures. He referred to America as a refuge from the tyrant in Britain, and he referred to it as a city on the hill. And we get that from Matthew 5:14. Now, remember in history who Nehemiah was. He actually brought the people back to the land of Israel and to rebuild Jerusalem. Now, John Winthrop would become the governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And history records that he was one of the poorest families in that colony. He would call the colony the New Jerusalem. And I think that's really interesting. These people really thought that they were the descendants of the Israelites. There was another major pastor that would come to the Massachusetts Bay Colony. We're going to talk about him next. That was Thomas Hooker. He was a prominent pastor in the Church of England. Because of his beliefs, Laud, who was the Archbishop of the Church of England, removed him from the pulpit. He was forced into retirement, and he later was issued a summons to appear in court. He broke his bail and fled to the Netherlands. He would eventually work his way into the Massachusetts Bay Colony. But his teachings did not coincide with the beliefs of the Puritans in the area of Massachusetts. So in 1636, Thomas Hooker formed a colony in Connecticut, and this colony was founded on religious freedom. Cotton Mather interviewed Thomas Hooker and would not allow him to be part of the Puritan Church in Massachusetts. Now, in 1638, Thomas Hooker told the Connecticut General Court that the people had a God-given right to choose their own leaders and magistrates. He also felt that all people should be allowed to vote. We can see that these are democratic principles. Now, in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, only the free men were allowed to vote. That meant that you were a member of the church, you were not a slave, and you had to own property. Now, Thomas Hooker was another one of the Democratic Puritan dissidents who found it impossible to agree with the leaders of the colony. He was not banished from the colony of Massachusetts, but instead sought to receive permission to establish another colony in Connecticut. So Thomas Hooker led about 100 people to begin a new settlement, which is called Hartford, Connecticut, named after Samuel Stone's hometown. Eventually, 3 more settlements would merge to form the Connecticut colony. Now, Thomas Hooker inspired the Fundamental Order of Connecticut. That was the first written democratic constitution to be established, establishing a republic and a representative government. This fundamental order would be the foundational document used to establish the American Constitution. Now, I find it unbelievable that Connecticut's motto is "He who transplants still sustains." And they have 3 vineyards or 3 grapevines on their coat of arms for Connecticut, or their government seal. Because these people understood that they were planting something, and they were planting a new vineyard. This was very easy to see this. Now, this leads us to discuss my favorite of all of the colonists in America, and that's Roger Williams. Now, Roger Williams, when he was 14 years old, caught the eye of Edward Coke. Edward Coke was like the Chief Justice in the land of England. His title was Attorney General, and he stood up and fought for the rights for the common man. He was the most prominent political figure during his time. Now, both King James and King Charles feared this man. And this was the man who would mentor Roger Williams. No doubt this is where Roger Williams got many of his teachings about freedom. Now, when Roger Williams was 28 years old, he was called to serve as a pastor in the church in Salem. He arrived on a ship called the Lion. On his way there, he was asked to speak in Boston, and this landed him immediately in trouble with the people. He taught that people should be free to worship God as they choose, without fear of punishment of government. Now, he was considered a heretic in the eyes of the people in Boston. Now, the people in Boston warned the Church of Salem that they'd hired a radical. And after 6 months of being in Salem, he would flee and live with the Pilgrims. Now, remember who the Pilgrims were. They were separatists. After 2 years, he would be invited back to be the pastor of Salem. The Puritans labeled him as the first rebel against the divine church order. Now, Governor Hayes, on January 11, 1636, ordered Captain Underwood and 14 other soldiers to kidnap Williams in the middle of the night and ship him back to England. But John Winthrop got ear of this and sent a young boy in the middle of the night to tell Williams about his fate. So Williams was sick in bed and got out of the bed with the flu and left in the middle of the night. And there he went and lived with the Indians. Now, he would then return back to England and ask for a charter in the land of America, in Rhode Island, to establish a colony based on religious freedom. So many of the separatists, the Seventh-day Baptists, and the Mennonites fled to this area. Now, he established his colony in a place called Providence because it would be divine providence. God truly was going to work a miracle through the teachings of Roger Williams. For many centuries, people were plagued with having government-controlled churches regulate their religious beliefs, and that was about to change in America. Roger Williams' radical teaching on freedom of religion become the basis and the foundation of some of the principles in our Constitution. This man would live and die and never know his influence on this country, and it was divine providence. Now, Governor Endicott would eventually invite Williams to return to Massachusetts, but Williams replied that he'd much rather live among the Christian savages than live among the Christians in Massachusetts Bay Colony. When the Constitution was first put forward to be amended by the 13 colonies, it would be Rhode Island that would refuse to sign. They refused to ratify the Constitution because they felt that the religious freedom in the Constitution was not being protected. Now, Thomas Jefferson and George Washington both saw this and agreed, and they amended the Constitution to include religious freedom. We can thank the state of Rhode Island today for freedom of religion because that's exactly where it came from. And most of the people that came to Rhode Island were the outcast. They were the people that didn't fit into the Puritan Church, the Church of England, which was the Anglican Church, and many of the other established churches. And it's really funny during Roger Williams' lifetime that very few people listened to his teachings on religious freedom. I'm sure he died thinking he was a total failure, that he never got anywhere with his beliefs. This goes to show the hand of God in what he does. This man would live and die and never know the influence he had on the American people and our government. Unbelievable. Now next, three men would come on the scene, and these three men would drastically change the landscape of both Britain and America. They would be George Whitefield, Charles, and John Wesley. Now they were educated in Oxford, and they belonged to something called a Holy Club. They weren't just a club, they were a church. And it was a small church of 8 men. Here's that number 8 again, new beginnings. So ask yourself, how does such a small church, such a small fellowship group make an impact? Because that is the way God likes to work. It's not the big churches and big organizations that He chooses His leaders from. He's looking for people with a heart, and these 8 men typified that. It's recorded that they fasted 3 times a week. They visited the people in prisons and the sick, the widows and the fatherless, and they studied the scriptures diligently. Now I want to read you an excerpt from a book on a biography of George Whitefield. It's called The Lightning Rod of the Great Awakening by Orpheus. He's talking about the Holy Club. He said they celebrated the Eucharist on Sunday, fasted on Wednesday and Friday, and used Saturday as their Sabbath to prepare for the Lord's feast. Now, this is a totally different picture than what's been portrayed by the historians that teach today. And if there hadn't been this spiritual revival before the American Revolution, I dare say we would not have won that war. But God gave us our freedom because we turned our hearts back. And this is what our country has been in the past, and it needs to return to. Now, the very first event that led us down the trail to the American Revolution was the Boston Massacre. On March 5th, 1770, a group of British soldiers with orders not to fire shot and killed 5 American protesters. Interestingly enough, the Boston Massacre fell on the 8th day of the 12th month on the Hebrew calendar. That's the 8th of Adar. This fell one day after the death of Moses, which was on Adar 7th. After Moses' death, Joshua was allowed to lead the people into the land of Canaan. This date would mark the beginning of the fight for our freedom and the establishment of our own land, just like in the land of Canaan with Joshua. There was truly no turning back at this point. We were headed for the American Revolution. Now, the American Revolution was caused by taxation. The Stamp Act was passed by the British Parliament on March 22nd, 1765. It required that the colonists pay taxes on every piece of printed paper they used. The purpose of the tax was to pay for the cost of defending the colonies on the frontiers in the Appalachian Mountains. The colonists were opposed to this tax because it was forced on them without any representation from them. First, there was the sugar tax, which was repealed, the Stamp Act, which was repealed, and the Townshend Act, which was repealed. And then there was the tea tax, and we all know how that ended. The people of Boston dumped 90,000 pounds of tea into the harbor. Now, the British were furious and wanted to show who was actually in charge, and they imposed the Intolerable Acts. It forced the people in the colonies to give bedding and food to the soldiers. The breaking away from the mother country was similar to the Israelites being in bondage. We at that time were in bondage to the throne of Britain. Just like Egypt was the most powerful nation of their time when the Israelites were in captivity, so was Britain the most powerful country of their time when America broke away from the homeland. They had come to see leaving England as the exodus of the Israelites. And we will find out that the American Revolution began during the week of Passover, the Passover season. Like the Israelites were told to take their staff in their hand and be in haste to leave the land of Egypt, Americans had Minutemen, and they were prepared to go at any moment. It's no doubt they identified with the Exodus. In 1777, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, both were given the commission to create the seal for America, along with Benjamin Franklin. Thomas Jefferson wanted to create a seal of the Israelites crossing the Red Sea. John Adams wanted to use the pillar of fire that led the Israelites across the Red Sea. They would eventually settle on the eagle because they understood that this country was created as a land of refuge. And also they probably understood Daniel 7, which talks about America being the eagle that's plucked from the head of the lion, which was England. Now, on April 14, 1775, General Gage, who was leading the British forces, received his orders to advance against the colonists. Now, those orders came from one of the relatives of his wife, and it's interesting, it's recorded that he had a skull and bones on his helmet, which symbolized the destroyer. Now, Gage's plan was to attack Concord. Now, remember, Concord is named after a grapevine or a type of a grape. And this would be the heart of the American Revolution, and it would start the American Revolution. This would be where the American Revolution would begin. He planned to attack Concord because it was reported that they were stockpiling weapons. Now, both Adams and Hancock were staying in Lexington, which is 7 miles from Concord. Now, there was a man named Josiah Nelson. He addressed a British soldier, resulting in being struck and told not to report this to anyone. And it's interesting that his name was Josiah. Now, let's go back to the biblical account, and that's going to be in 1 Kings 12, verse 33. You remember the story about Jeroboam feared that the Israelites would go back to Jerusalem for the Feast of Tabernacles. So he set up 2 golden calves in Bethel, and he set up his feast to be the 8th month, 15th day. And this event would permanently separate the northern tribes from the southern tribes. They would never come together again, not even for holy days. Now, Jeroboam would be visited by a prophet, and that prophet told him that there would come a man named Josiah who would be king, and he would destroy the 2 golden calves. Now, this prophecy would not be fulfilled for 182 years. The year that Jeroboam built the 2 golden calves was 931 BC. Josiah would be born in 649 BC. That's 182 years before Josiah would be born. Now, when he was 26 years old, he would restore the temple and institute God's laws, and he burnt that place in Bethel with the 2 golden calves, just like the prophet had told Jeroboam. And this prophecy was fulfilled at Passover season. Now, the American Revolution was started 182 years after Columbus would discover the New World. Isn't that something? Now, Josiah's job was to restore the house of God. And it's interesting that there's 182 years before that prophecy was fulfilled, and 182 years after Columbus settled the New World up to the American Revolution. Now, the shot that was said to be able to be heard around the world happened on the bridge in Lexington. On April 19th, 8 Americans would die on that bridge, and that would begin the American Revolution. This would take place during the week of Passover, or unleavened bread. How unbelievably significant. Now, this war did not go well for the colonists. And by the time of the winter of Valley Forge, most of the American troops had deserted. It was very obvious at that point that we had lost this war. And George Washington and many of the military leaders knew and understood their fate. They would eventually be caught and drawn and quartered as dissenters. All of these people who signed the Declaration of Independence understood their fate when they signed the document, and for all practical purposes we had lost this war. But at Valley Forge, George Washington received a vision from God. He was visited by an angel who told him that we would win this war, and she showed George Washington the future of this country. From that point on, we won every battle, and you could see God's hand in this revolution. Just like Gideon had too many troops, George Washington would take the men that had not deserted, that had not left, those true patriots. With the help of God, they won this war. And there's no doubt if God had not intervened for this country, we would have lost the American Revolution. I have a program out on my website, 12tribehistory.com, that goes through all the miracles of the American Revolution if you want to hear it. Now, I want to cover one more significant event, and that is the signing of the Declaration of Independence on July 4th, 1776. This would happen on the date of the Tammuz 17th. Tammuz 17th was a day of fasting in the land of Israel. It was one of the 4 fast days. It represented the fall of Israel. It's probably the first date that the northern tribes were attacked by Assyria. Now, Israel was promised punishment for 7 times 7, which would have been 2,520 years. If you count from 745 BC, 2,520 years, you come to the exact date of 1776. God began the captivity of the northern tribes in 745 BC, and he began this country on July 4th, the 17th of Tammuz, which represents the fall of those tribes, those northern tribes. This country was founded on a covenant, and their purpose was not just to come to worship God, but to spread the gospel. The charter at Jamestown stated that they came to teach the savages and the infidels about the Messiah. In Christopher Columbus's writings, he talked about how he understood that coming to the New World helped further the gospel. We need to understand that the reason this nation has been blessed and has prospered is because our goal was to spread the gospel. Our purpose was to spread the gospel, which they have done through the centuries by doing missionary works in Africa, South America, and many other lands. That is the true reason why we've been blessed. Now, please understand the importance of the founding of this country and God's hand in it. I don't know how anybody could deny that after hearing this program.